The moment I walked through my front door, I knew something was wrong. I'd been gone for 11 days, 5 in the hospital after my knee replacement, 6 more at my brother Gerald's place in Sudbury while I got back on my feet. Gerald had driven 4 hours each way to pick me up from Toronto General, which tells you everything you need to know about my brother, 63 years old, and he still shows up without being asked. My son-in-law did not pick me up. My daughter called to say he was swamped at work and that they'd make it up to me. I took a cab. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. Not bad, exactly just different. Someone else's fabric softener. A candle I didn't recognize. The kitchen light was on even though it was 2 in the afternoon and the house faces south and gets plenty of sun. Small things. The kind of things you only notice when you've lived somewhere for 31 years and you know every creak in the floor and every draft from the window above the stairs. I set my bag down by the door and called out. No answer. My daughter was at work. She's a dental hygienist at a clinic in Scarborough, Tuesday through Friday. My son-in-law's schedule was harder to track. He'd been between jobs more than he'd been employed since they moved in with me 2.5 years ago, after what my daughter called a rough patch. I'd stopped asking for details. I walked down the hall toward my office. I've had that room set up the same way since 2004. Dark wood desk my late wife Margaret picked out. Her reading chair in the corner, the green one with the worn armrest she always sat on. Bookshelves floor to ceiling. A photo of the two of us at Lake Louise 1991, the summer before my daughter was born. That room is the closest thing I have to her, 20 years after losing her. The door was locked, not stuck, not swollen from the humidity the way it gets in August. Locked, with a deadbolt I had never seen before. Mounted at eye level, shiny and new. The kind you buy at Canadian Tire on a Saturday morning when you've decided something belongs to you. I stood there for a moment. I actually checked the door number, as if I might have walked down the wrong hallway in my own home. Then I knocked. No answer. I knocked harder. I went to find my son-in-law. He was in the basement, my basement, watching something on a laptop with wireless headphones on. He didn't hear me come down the stairs. I stood in front of him until he looked up and pulled one ear off. "Oh," he said, "you're back. Not welcome home. Not how are you feeling. Just you're back." Like I was a package he'd forgotten he'd ordered. I told him the office door was locked and asked him what was going on. He set the laptop aside slowly, the way people do when they're choosing their words, and he said his mother had needed a place to stay. Temporarily. He said it had just made sense to use the office since I wasn't there. He said my things were in the storage room off the laundry. I want to be precise about what happened inside me in that moment, because it matters for everything that came after. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was something colder, something that felt like looking at a stranger wearing your clothes. I asked him when he had planned to tell me. He said they were going to explain everything when I got home. I asked him who had installed the lock. He said he had, because his mother needed her privacy. I nodded. I walked back upstairs. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I looked out the window at the backyard, the maple I planted the year my daughter turned 5, the garden beds Margaret had started, and I'd kept up ever since, and I thought about the kind of man I wanted to be in the next 10 minutes. My daughter's name is Renee. She is 34 years old. She has her mother's eyes, and, for most of her life, her mother's decency. I say most because what I discovered over the following 48 hours changed some of what I thought I knew. My son-in-law's name is Curtis. He is 37. He grew up in Hamilton, has a brother somewhere out west, and has a mother named Beverly, who I had met exactly once, briefly, at their wedding 6 years ago. I had no reason to think about her much before that afternoon. When Renee came home from work, I was still at the kitchen table. I hadn't moved because my knee was aching and because I was waiting. She came in through the side door, saw me, and stopped. "Dad," she said, "how was the drive?" I told her I'd taken a cab. I told her to sit down. She sat. She looked at her hands. And then she said something that I have thought about almost every day since. She said she knew I was going to be upset, but that she'd thought once I saw how good it looked, once I met Beverly properly, I would understand. I asked her when she had decided to do this. She said they'd been thinking about it for a while. Beverly had been renting a basement apartment in Hamilton, and the landlord had sold the building and she needed to leave by the end of the month. Renee said it was just supposed to be a few months. I asked her why she hadn't called me. I'd been at Gerald's. I had a phone. She knew the number. She said she hadn't wanted to worry me while I was recovering. I asked her if she thought I would find a deadbolt on my office door less worrying than a phone call. She didn't answer that. I told her I wanted the lock removed by morning. I told her I needed to sleep and that we would talk more tomorrow. She nodded and said of course and reached across the table and touched my hand. And I let her, and I went upstairs to bed. I lay awake for 3 hours. What I was turning over in my mind wasn't the lock, exactly. It was the timing. I'd been away for 11 days. My knee surgery had been scheduled for 4 months. Renee had known the dates, which meant the decision to bring Beverly in had been made while I was either in the hospital or in Sudbury deliberately. I was beginning to think, timed, so that by the time I got home, the situation would already be established, already a fact. I've worked in insurance for 35 years. I know how people behave when they're hoping you won't look too closely. The next morning I woke early, made coffee, and waited. Beverly came downstairs at 8:30 in a housecoat, opened the fridge as if it were hers, and looked genuinely surprised to see me. She was a small woman, early 60s, not unfriendly in the way she held herself, but there was a sharpness behind her eyes that I recognized. She said, "Oh, you must be Renee's dad." She poured herself a coffee from my coffee maker, with my beans, and sat down at my kitchen table. I said yes. I said I was also the person whose name was on the mortgage. She smiled like I'd made a joke. She said Renee had told her so much about me. She said I had a beautiful home. I thanked her. I asked her what her plans were in terms of finding her own place. She said she was still looking. She said Hamilton was getting so expensive. She said she appreciated my patience. I said I hadn't offered patience. I asked her to have a more specific timeline by the end of the week. She stopped smiling. The lock, it turned out, had not been removed overnight. Curtis had taken the deadbolt off the door, but he'd left a hook and eye latch on the inside, and still had what appeared to be most of Beverly's belongings arranged throughout the room, including on Margaret's reading chair, a suitcase open on the floor, toiletries on my desk. I went to my storage room. My files were there, stacked in cardboard boxes, a few stacked on top of the chest freezer. Margaret's reading chair photo, the Lake Louise one, had been laid flat on top of a box, face down. I stood there for a long time. My name is Robert. I am 66 years old. I am semi-retired, still consulting part-time for the firm I spent my career at. I own my home outright, paid off the mortgage in 2019. I have a good GP, a reasonable pension, a brother who drives 4 hours when I need him, and one daughter. I went back upstairs. I found my laptop, and I called my lawyer. Paulette has handled my affairs for 12 years. She's efficient, and she doesn't soften things, which I appreciate. I explained the situation. She asked a few questions. She told me what I could and couldn't do legally, given that Renee and Curtis had been residing in the home for 2.5 years. She told me the steps I would need to follow to formally establish that Beverly was not a tenant and had no residency rights. She told me to document everything. I took photos of the storage room. I took photos of the modified office door. I wrote down the dates and the conversations. Then I did something I probably should have done a year earlier. I called an old colleague who still works in risk assessment and asked him if he'd ever come across a Curtis Brennan, formerly of a mid-sized logistics company in Mississauga. He called me back the next morning. Curtis had been let go from that job 18 months before he and Renee moved in with me. The reason wasn't company restructuring, which is what Renee had told me. He'd been dismissed following an internal audit. There had been no charges laid, sometimes there aren't, when a company wants to avoid the paperwork and the publicity. But the circumstances involved the misappropriation of a fuel expense account over approximately 14 months. The total was not small. I sat with that for a day. I want to be clear that I don't tell you this to condemn Curtis entirely. People do things when they're desperate and frightened that they wouldn't do otherwise. But I had let this man live in my home. I had lent my daughter money twice in the past 2 years, once for car repairs, once, she said, for a dental emergency that I now suspected had gone elsewhere. I had believed what I was told, because she was my daughter, and you want to believe your daughter. That evening, Renee came home from work, and I asked her to sit with me in the backyard. We sat in the lawn chairs by the maple tree, and I watched her for a moment before I said anything. She looked tired. She'd looked tired for a long time, I realized. I'd mistaken it for adulthood. I asked her to tell me about Curtis's job. The real story. She looked at the tree for a while. Then she told me. Not everything, but enough she confirmed he'd been dismissed, that there had been an issue with expenses, that it had been complicated. She said they'd been dealing with debt ever since. She said she was sorry she hadn't told me. I asked her where the money I'd given her had gone. She didn't answer right away. Then she said some of it had gone toward what they owed. I nodded. I told her I loved her. I told her that hadn't changed. Then I told her that I needed them to leave, all three of them. She started to explain why that wasn't possible right now, why the timing was difficult, why Beverly had nowhere to go, why they needed more time. I let her finish. I told her I'd spoken to Paulette. I told her I understood my obligations and I was prepared to meet them. I would give them 60 days, written notice, all done properly. I told her that Beverly, who had no formal arrangement with me at all, would need to find other accommodations sooner than that. Renee said I was being cruel. I told her that installing a lock on a door in my own home, while I was recovering from surgery, without asking me, was also a form of cruelty. I told her that deciding what to tell me and what to hide was a form of cruelty. I told her I wasn't saying these things to punish her, but because they were true and we had never been the kind of family that pretended otherwise. She cried. I didn't hold it against her. Curtis I handled separately. The following morning, at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold between us, I told him what I knew. I didn't embellish it. He didn't deny much. He said he'd been planning to tell me. I said the time for that had passed. I told him I expected him to behave with decency toward Renee during the transition, whatever came after between the two of them. He said he would. I believed him, somewhat. I spoke to Beverly last. I told her she had 2 weeks, that I was prepared to help her identify subsidized housing options in Hamilton and the surrounding area if she needed a starting point, and that I bore her no ill will. She wasn't entirely responsible for her son's choices. She took the information I printed out for her and she left 12 days later with a woman I assumed was a friend. She didn't say goodbye. Over the following weeks, while Curtis and Renee worked through the logistics of leaving, I will spare you the details of that. Because it belonged to them more than to me, I started putting my office back together. I brought Margaret's chair up from storage first. I sat in it, in the empty room, before I moved anything else back in. The afternoon light came through the window the way it always had. The maple was turning outside. I want to say something about forgiveness, because people always want to know about that part. Renee and I still speak. We have dinner together roughly once a month, at a restaurant, Neutral Ground, which was her suggestion and a good one. She is working through things with a counselor. Curtis is no longer in the picture that ended a few months after they moved out, and while I can't say I'm sorry, I told Renee I wouldn't say so out loud because it wasn't useful to her. The money I lent her I wrote off a long time ago. Paulette redid my will in November. Renee is still in it, not all of it, but enough. I decided she deserved a second chance at being my daughter. I'm still deciding what that means. What I have now is what I had before any of this started. My house, my office, Margaret's chair, and the maple in the backyard that I planted when the world was simpler and which doesn't care, one way or another, about any of the things that happen inside. Some mornings I have my coffee at the kitchen table and I look out at it and I think that is not nothing. It is actually quite a lot. If you're watching this and you've let someone stay a little too long, or believe something because it was easier than asking, I am not here to judge you. I did the same thing. I just want you to know that it is possible to reclaim what is yours, not perfectly, not without cost, but with your dignity intact. That is what I came home to, in the end.